So next, I'm really excited to bring up the panel on entrepreneurship. And part of the joy of living in Palo Alto, where I live, is that I've been able to consult with so many startups over the years and see how businesses are built. And often I think, I wish advertising had more of a sensibility around invention and entrepreneurship. And so we're going to hear now how certain agencies are actually infusing that thinking into their business models. So please welcome Mark Barden, who's going to moderate, and he'll introduce his panelists.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good. Practice your voice, because we're going to want lots of questions about this panel. We are going to talk about intrapreneurship, which is a fabulous buzzword. I'm sure you've all heard that used before. Essentially, it is acting and thinking like an entrepreneur inside a large organization. And we have three experts up on stage with us here today. We have, right next to me here is Constance DeCherney, who's going to talk about the work that she's been doing as an intrapreneur inside the digital powerhouse iCrossing. We have Nathalie, who's going to talk about her history as an entrepreneur and her work, I hope, that you've been doing at Barnard, teaching entrepreneurship to young women. And finally, here's Scott McAfee, all the way from Austin, Texas, who's going to talk about the work that he's done inside his agency, Sanders Wingo, around entrepreneurship. Before we start, and I unleash the wit and wisdom of these three panelists on you, I'd just like to frame this conversation for you, and this will be a kind of how to listen to the content here. I think it's no secret that the advertising industry has been significantly disrupted in the last few years. It's been written about very often about the ways that we can reach consumers is changing fundamentally. There are all sorts of new competitors that we, in the agency world, compete with. And that is having a significant impact on our ability to generate business, create value for clients, and create margin for ourselves. So in that disruptive arena, it's really important for agency folks like yourselves to begin thinking about what are the new models that you can create. How can you apply your own creativity not just to clients' problems, but to solving the problems of the industry? And so we've got three examples here of people who've done that. So listen to their journeys, their experiences, and learn from that. And I think the second and important point is about talent. And I'm sure you're going to talk about this because we've prepared a little bit, about the development and retention of talent. And you know, we're right now on the edge of Silicon Valley. I'm sure you've all got a similar kind of dynamic in many of the markets you work in. Retaining and developing talent when there are opportunities that are as exciting as a startup up the street or Twitter down the road is a very significant business problem for our industry. So using the ideas that these guys have developed and to create opportunities for people internally and retain that talent and give them an opportunity to express themselves and their creativity internally is a big part of what this is about. So listen to that. Is that you? Do you want to stay in an agency and start something? It'd be great to have you at the end ask our panelists some questions around that. So I think 2 or 3 minutes from each of you first to talk about what your entrepreneurial activity has been in the last few years at your agencies and how you got there. And I'll start with you, Constance.
Sure. So I run a program called the Collaboratory at iCrossing, and it's designed to pair startups and our clients in order to make stuff that they couldn't otherwise make together. And our role as an agency in that is to foster ideas and then to execute the ideas that we come up with. And the reason for it was really simple, that there were 2 factors. One, clients were asking for it. So if your client asks for something, you should probably think about delivering on that. And 2, we were watching, as Mark just alluded to, we were watching this creative diaspora unfold in front of us. We were watching talent walk out the door and go to Pinterest or go to Google or go to Facebook or go to SoundCloud or whatever it was. And we sat on the executive team and we said, this is really bad and it's not going to stop. How can we bring that creative energy back into the agency, not just for our own talent, but for the minds that are at those startups today to help us solve some of our clients' biggest challenges? So we launched in February, and to date we've worked with Toyota, Starwood Hotels, DirecTV, Ally Bank. and I'm forgetting a couple others. But in order to just sort of think through what their problems are and how startups might help them solve it. Some of it's ad tech and media optimizations on the sort of far left, and then the space where we're mostly focused is on creative ideas. So inspiring our ECDs and CDs to come up with ideas that are baked in collaboration, so that the idea exists across many platforms and includes partnerships with Reddit or SoundCloud or Uber or whoever the right fit is for that brand.
Great, thank you. So you also have a lab, Scott.
We do. My agency is Sanders Wingo. I'm here with 3 others of us. Rhonda Doré, Shantika Seigers, and Leslie Wingo are here. And we created, almost exactly a year ago, we launched our behavioral science lab. And that was something we began in early 2012, so it was almost a year and a half in development. As an agency, we're a creative agency, but we've always been strategically driven because obviously the more we know and the more we knew about the audience, the better the creative was, the more personal it was, the more interesting it was. And so we've always been strategically driven as well. And we had the opportunity, by chance, we connected with a consultancy made up of PhDs, computer scientists, experimental psychologists, and we started talking, and they had a consultancy for businesses, and we started developing tools for branding and market research based on what they knew and what we knew. And we kind of experimented with that over many months to get it right. And what we learned along the way was we were really onto something, because one of the nagging things that was always on my mind when I was a creative director was you need research. Research is critical. And to all the creatives who don't believe that, it is foolhardy, because you're just nowhere without it. The problem is it's just not very good. Research is one of those things where people wave it around on the client side. They'll say, well, we did the research, which is essentially an insurance policy from getting in trouble, because we did the research. And it's sort of a placebo that inspires people to create these PowerPoint decks that go on forever, but it really doesn't help. I don't know how many of us have ever walked out of a research briefing thinking, wow, I thought it was this way, but now I realize it's this way, and I'm having this complete epiphany. And I don't think any of us have done that. And so it's this weird process that we have to go through to feel like we've done our job when it's just kind of an exercise. And so we've always had this nagging feeling that we could do better. And as we see, brands like Google and Facebook compile all this big data, which much of it is extremely interesting. On the other side of the big data is it's so overwhelming that you can slice it any number of ways. So that's another raw material that really isn't really that helpful unless you've got some kind of supercomputer and a university behind you. So here was this opportunity to create the kind of research and the kind of study and understanding of behavior that was really, truly insightful. And because the problem with existing research is, we know what people have done, but we don't know why. Quantitative research, qualitative research doesn't tell you why people did it. It tells you what they did. It doesn't tell you why they did it. It doesn't tell you what they might do in a marketplace that's moving very quickly. And then it doesn't tell you the different influences. We have a tendency to look at human behavior in a very kind of one-dimensional way. And we're three-dimensional creatures. We have very increasingly complicated lives. We have many influences on our purchase behavior. Yep. And those come from so many angles: our friends, our family, our upbringing, and all these things. And demographics, 10 35-year-old women are 10 completely different people. They might all have bachelor's degrees. So anyway, these were the things that we thought about as we developed our lab, and we have some methodologies that are much more holistic, much more three-dimensional, and they really give us a greater map into the behavior of our audience. And
Okay.
we just launched it a year ago. We've gotten a lot of attention from major brands. We've been invited to speak in conferences all over the world. So it's been pretty exciting, and we're just now getting started.
Great. Okay. So there's a couple of threads I'd like to pick up between the two of you. But Nathalie, why don't you give us a little bit of a background on yourself and your own entrepreneurial endeavors?
That, excuse me, that motivation, the supercomputer or the university that you want to have behind you to number crunch and to sort of understand the space is where I landed and how I landed at Barnard at Columbia. So I'm a serial tech entrepreneur, recovering, I should say. I decided to take a couple of years off a couple of years ago, so you're catching me at the most relaxed state I have probably ever been in my entire career. But what I did is I gravitated towards that university environment precisely because being the only woman in the room for most of my career and being the only Latina for about 10 miles of any place I've ever been, there was a lot of question both within the startup world, which is where I grew up, but also eventually after mergers and acquisitions, being in the corporate world as well, and obviously still retaining my entrepreneurial blood, sweat, and tears. There was a lot of concern around why women were leaving, not just within my own organization, but also within my clients' organizations, working with Microsoft and Starbucks and MTV and Disney and Mattel and all of the different, mainly entertainment companies that I worked with. Why the women that were being fast-tracked were leaving before the general manager or the VP level. And so it was a large pressing question that even during my time off never ceased to concern me. And so I joined the Athena Center for Leadership Studies, which is a center that is headquartered at Barnard, Columbia, and is charged really with the mission of figuring out what is the secret sauce that Barnard College has, that for 125 years has been churning out amazing women leaders across all fields at a rate that is astounding, but also relative to the rest of the college campuses around this country. Study after study show that women actually are leaving the four-year college experience in the United States with lower self-esteem than they came in. And there are very few exceptions to those rules, and Barnard is one of them. And so the premise of the President Spar, when she arrived on campus, was we need to figure out what that secret sauce is, and then we need to bottle it and codify it, and we need to unleash it on the rest of the world so that you don't have to be at an Ivy League school to get access to this.
Right.
And so when I arrived, the center was focused largely on working with corporate women, mid to senior level women, figuring out what that is in terms of diagnosing with people, with amazing people like John Gerzema, who is a fellow of the center, or Lima Bowie, right, the Nobel Prize Peace winner from Liberia. Just amazing people who help us diagnose within large organizations what is it that is not supporting women, and how do we fix it? Working with the organization, not just with the women, because the women aren't broken. And for me, what I bring to the table is that I founded a center within the center that focuses on entrepreneurship. And the reason that this conversation is interesting to me is that I have been focused entirely on leveling the playing field for women entrepreneurs, and there's other people within the center who are focused on corporate. But I'm finding that the clients, to your point, in terms of what they ask us for, are asking us to actually merge our two disciplines. You know, people like Eric Ries have redefined what it means to be a startup as a startup is a high-risk venture. Doesn't matter if it's a startup or if it's within an organization, right?
Yeah.
Those conversations of these blurred lines are becoming really critical, and so I'm being brought into the corporate engagements to diagnose and address those systemic issues. And I'm also bringing the best of the best people like John into the world of entrepreneurship to see what we can leverage. So
Right.
I think the lines are increasingly blurry, and they're very interesting.
Yeah, and I know that one of the things that we spoke about on the phone last week, which I'll ask you to come on to in a moment, is that women have, in some ways, competitive advantage, and the data's showing that women are better entrepreneurs. So I think that'll be a good moment for us. So we have a...
I found that at self-servingstatistics.com.
So, yeah, exactly. Good. Well, we're all for self-serving statistics today, I think. So we have a laboratory that's built around collaboration between yourselves and startups,
Yeah.
and your clients and startups. We have a laboratory that's built around synthesizing all the different kind of new data that we have to understand decision-making processes out there in the world. So I'm interested to some degree in the what, but I think what's really helpful for us to hear about now is how. You know, you're sitting out there, you probably, many of you, because you're creative people, will have notes in the margin of every notebook you've started about, here's a cool idea. And they don't go anywhere, and I think that's partly connected to the previous speaker. You know, let's activate some of those. Let's do that. So just give us a little bit of a sense of how did you get started? You're sitting there, you have this hunch. You're sitting inside an agency that has a business model, and you have to go to leadership, your peers, and say, I want to carve out some time and some money and some energy of the organization to focus on this idea, which is high risk, uncertain rewards, at a time when our business is being disrupted. How did that go?
Well, it went surprisingly well. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. The path to creating your own organization within a corporate structure for me started with a very persuasive argument, which was that I was really tired. I was running 3 accounts, about $100 million in media, $20 million in creative, and I was 29. I was like, well, we're doing it. We're doing really well. But something is missing, which is that these ideas that we're coming up with are satisfying the client, but they're not changing their business in any way. They're getting to their goals, but they're not exceeding their goals in any way. So we're doing fine. So I said to the president of the agency at the time, I feel like we could do a lot better. And he said, okay, what does that mean? And I put together, like a 6-slide keynote of this idea where we looked at the agency landscape, which is $33 billion business, the venture-backed startup community that was working really closely with brands, and so it tried to narrow in on that Venn diagram of where the creative ideas were coming from, and then took a look at what would be authentic for iCrossing. We're not a creative agency, we're a digital agency. So we couldn't go in and say, we're gonna come up with these big TV commercials or whatever. We had to do something that was authentic to us. We looked across the landscape at the other digital agencies to understand what they were doing against innovation and startups, and included that in the recommendation, and then went to Hearst Ventures. iCrossing is owned by the Hearst Corporation. So we went to Hearst Ventures and kind of got a litmus test, does this sound like a reasonable thing? Are startups gonna wanna work with us? We think they're gonna wanna work with us. Kind of got a feel for it. And then we talked to a bunch of partners. So we have a big relationship with Google. We talked to them and said, would your creative team want to work with us? They have this thing called the Zoo at Google. Would you guys want to brainstorm ideas and make badass shit with us? Yes, okay, cool. Went to Facebook, was like, do you guys want to let us in? Maybe we'll do some stuff. They're like, yeah, that sounds great. Went to a couple small startups and said, do you guys want to make some stuff? All right, cool. So we had a handful of founding partners, and then went to the creative team and said, what would happen if we changed your brief? What would happen if we challenged you to come up with partnerships in addition to big concepts? Would you execute those? Would you want to execute those? Are those things you would be proud of? And they're like, yeah, we have to do stuff that's modern and relevant, and people are spending more time on Spotify than they are on iTunes. Let's do it. And so we pitched it. We pitched it and we pitched it and we pitched it, and some people were like, whatever, just do the job you had, you were good at that. And other people were like, yeah, this is gonna be amazing. And then we put a lot of rigor around the process, which I think is really important. If anyone has an idea out there that they wanna change something in the agency, map out what the ideal process is gonna look like for change so that everyone knows in the organization how their role is going to be affected or not affected, and what you expect from them. Because I think, the one thing that I said to Mark last week, the one thing that we kind of screwed up on when we launched was requiring change. We let people we let people go a little, and let them sort of keep doing their job as they'd done it before, even though we were making an organizational change. And we let that happen sort of organically. I think we could have done a better job of sort of institutionalizing this process change. So I would say that's the one thing that I would have been a little bit stronger on, but we're doing it now.
So good. So understanding that you have an amazing amount of assets in your network already, and seeing what the opportunities are, all those partnerships, all those brands that you listed off. that was the sort of start point for this thing, and then getting really clear with the organization about how you needed to change. So that's, you know, one thing we can take away from this is understanding the assets that are in your network and seeing them in a different way and seeing new opportunities in them. Your initiation was kind of random, wasn't it? Tell about how you get started.
It was very random, but of course in hindsight everything makes perfect sense. And in 2012, I had recently handed over our creative department to Sean Seigers, who's a fantastic creative director. And so it was the first time in 20 years I was not in a creative department. And I made a point to kind of move out of the department, give her all the room she needed to do the great work she's doing. And I moved my office in between my two of my partners in the agency. And that was a really a new experience. So I was trying to figure out, how do I continue to be creative? And one of the things we were doing is we've always been involved in our local advertising federation. And in the Austin Advertising Federation, there were a couple of guys from a consultancy that are now our partners in the lab. And they specialized in sort of enterprise management and leadership and using psychology to understand how companies work and how to kind of work the kinks out internally. And we actually retained them to do an audit of the Advertising Federation. So I was invited to a brainstorm session led by them with that board of the Ad Fed, and it was happening inside an outdoor company's office. And I thought, wow, I can either do that or pull my fingernails out with a pair of pliers. Because it just didn't sound very fun. You know, brainstorm sessions, immediately, you know you're in for a train wreck. So
I run those for a living, though, Scott. You know that, right?
Well, they must be very good. But usually they're not very good. And so I show up, and there are these nerdy guys, all PhDs. And you know, I'm a nerdy guy, but these guys made me feel like Mick Jagger. And we're all standing around, and the office is just a bit too small. And I'm just kind of like, okay. And as the whole thing unfolded, it was really cool, and it was really relaxing and really disarming. And they had this process of kind of collecting ideas and information, and it was very self-directed, where the group sort of directed itself. And within like an hour, we had a really clear outline of what we needed to do.
Right.
And I was like, wow, I've never experienced that. So we really hit it off. Tim and Ron and I started talking. And I really loved what they were doing. And they asked me over lunch at one point, do you think this process could work for branding and for market research? I was like, yes, it could. And I immediately enlisted one of our senior strategic planners at the agency, Christian Goy. And Christian is incredible. He's from Berlin originally. He's the most emotional German you'll ever meet. And a wonderful combination of analytical skill and style and storytelling. And a great leader in terms of getting things done, because that's not my thing. And so we teamed up on it, and we just kept working, kept experimenting. We kept mapping out how the process could work. And we did a lot of just schematics and sort of wireframing the whole process for quite a few months before we brought it to my partners on the agency side and to show them and see what they thought. And even though I'm one of the partners and one of the decision makers, I was almost more vigilant about that approval process than I would have otherwise, because I certainly didn't want to embarrass myself in front of my business partners. But I know them. I knew the kind of questions they would ask. So we tried to be pretty bulletproof, and we sat down, and they immediately saw the merit and saw the value. So over a period of a year, it was a process of just, you know, loosening up a little bit of money and a little bit of resources, testing it out, trying to figure out tests that were valid, because wishful thinking is an incredible motivator, but it's also a trap. And we just kept testing it. And then by, like I said, October of 2013, we had enough case studies, we had enough understanding. And more than anything, it wasn't just, can we prove this to clients? I can't sell something if I don't believe it. So we had to prove it to ourselves. We had to know and kind of taste it and feel it, that this is really working, and this is giving us a much better picture of consumer behavior and human decision-making and sort of three-dimensional behavioral dynamics. And once we felt like that was working, we just, we launched it.
So I'm interested, Nathalie, if you could speak to this for us. If you had not handed off your responsibility for creative duties, which freed up some mental space for you and some open-mindedness, if you'd have seen the opportunity that presented itself to you when it did in those two super nerdy guys who we should have next year at the conference.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about that mindset of the entrepreneur, Nathalie, in your experience about being ready and open and curious and being able to spot opportunity when it presents itself, as these two both do?
I mean, the two things that I see as a connecting point, and the one thing that seemed really strong in what you said, for example, was both obviously super strong on the testing in front of the client, right? Pretty lean startup methodology 101, right? Going out and testing it out instead of formulating your own opinion with a bunch of PhDs in a room, which is always useful maybe in the beginning, but never at the end. At the end, it's all about the customer. But also, I think that one of the things that women especially tend to bring to the table disproportionately, is that women tend to demand that the process be worthy, whatever that criteria is, right? And that's something that I think is important, because I think that in a world that is focused largely on outcomes, that's where we lose people. And I think that sometimes we in the entrepreneurial world forget that as well, and we do focus entirely on outcomes. And testing, and does the product work, and so on. And I think that one of the things that I love about women, and they introduce that into all fields, whether it be the startup world or as an entrepreneur, it's that they demand that the process work for them and for those around them. And it creates outcomes that are solid, but processes that get you there, that make you want to go to work in the morning.
Can you talk as well about, this is the time to bring out some more of those stats that you have about, you talked about women who've gone off on maternity leave and come back and have to reinvent themselves.
Right.
That is what they're learning in that moment is more entrepreneurial behavior. Talk about that.
Right. So, I mean, two of the observations as I was thinking about the exodus, right, or the problem of retention, or any of those challenges, is that who in the world where you have seen a large drop-off of women, or where you see not enough of a representation of women, who in that demographic, or who in that sort of ecosystem is most apt to be entrepreneurial, if that's an important thing that a company wants to introduce? And I'm thinking it's the ones who left. It's the ones who left and started their own businesses. It's the ones who went on maternity leave and had to redefine themselves and be freelancers and rebrand themselves and really sort of reinvent themselves, and sometimes multiple times within a short time frame. Yeah. That skill and that muscle that now has been exercised by that segment of the population, which happens to be women in this case and in this industry, that is what you need if you want to infuse entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial life into an organization. And so getting those people back in the room is important, not just for the health of the business, I think, but also to the future of the business. All the studies that I am working with these days show us that if you want to retain young entrepreneurial talent, and if you want to retain young entrepreneurial thinkers that are women, then you want to embed into their culture that they get exposed to mentorship and sponsorship, and senior mentorship and sponsorship. So not only are those women who have left and who have reinvented themselves and who I think are a huge asset to bring back to an organization good for the company and for the creativity of the company, but they will be the key to retaining that young talent that most people are having trouble retaining.
I would just comment on we talked a lot yesterday about mentorship, which I think is important, but I would say the thing that let me be successful in making a startup within a big corporation was actually sponsorship. I had two sponsors. One was the chief strategy officer of the agency, was my boss at the time, and then another woman on the executive team who is the head of business development, who really championed this idea that an individual inside our company could come up with something new, and they together really just, I don't know, they had like a really big trumpet that was culturally what they wanted to see over and over again. And they've encouraged other people to take, various size ideas and run with it. I think as entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs ourselves, we too can champion those new ideas and sponsor other people's concepts to really take them to the end, because it does matter. Like, it's not just about having a mentor you can bounce ideas off of. Someone else is going to have to raise their hand and say, I support this and I support her.
And now that you have a proof point internally, have you noticed change in appetite and the culture around, let's do more of this entrepreneurial stuff, it's cool, it works?
Yeah, definitely. We after we launched the Collaboratory, the president, Brian Poley, who's based here in San Francisco, launched this thing called Passion Projects, where anyone who wants to spend 10% of their time over the, it's like a couple hours a week, on something that's personal, not related to work, anyone can raise their hand to work on it. So I think increasingly there's an appetite for stuff that's just sort of percolated. We call it the cutting room floor. Y'all call it the cutting room floor. I'm not a creative, but you do. Getting those ideas up off the floor and out into the world makes you feel good and makes you feel like it wasn't just about what the client picked, but what's inside your heart. And that can be a part of your portfolio.
I want to just come back and see if we can connect these 2 points, because Nathalie, your point about, yesterday there was a lot of conversation about women have babies and they leave and the maternity leave, and it was always presented as kind of like a bit of a down moment where, well, and then you have to come back and reinvent yourself. And you've reframed it nicely for us as saying, actually, that's a major opportunity because you can represent yourself to the world as somebody who has been out, had other experiences, brought the insights in, and you have to reinvent yourself. So is there a way to think about women as being better qualified for actually that reinvention process? And it sounds like you had mentors who've been through that, Constance, and were prepared to champion you as a consequence.
All my bosses are mothers and fathers.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dads are hugely important.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that maybe even to reframe your reframe, you said that women can present themselves and sort of rebrand and sort of reinvent. I would challenge us to simply accept that they're doing it.
Right.
With or without our help,
right.
And with or without acceptance, they're becoming mommy bloggers, or they're starting their own ventures, or they're starting their own agencies, or whatever thing they're doing. Whether we support them or not, they're doing it. More small businesses in this country are owned by women than by men, and they are undercapitalized and they are undervalued, which to me just seems like a really amazing business opportunity. But they're there and the quantities are there. Unlike, for example, coding, where we have a dearth of women coders, and yes, we have half as many women today graduating in computer science as 10 years ago. That is not the case with entrepreneurs. We do not have a pipeline problem. Women are reinventing themselves with or without our support. And so I think that in corporations, the job is to either tap into that resource and value it and bring it back in, or to continue to allow them to reinvent themselves and work, outside of that.
So,
for us, we don't have many initiatives, or it's sort of baked into our culture. And if you went to our website, we have the idea of being creative entrepreneurs right on our homepage. And David Sanders founded the agency when he was 50 years old, and then worked in it for another 40 years.
Wow.
And he hadn't worked in advertising before. Bob Wingo hadn't worked in advertising before. He was our biggest client. So the idea of entrepreneurship has always been a big part of the culture. And we also have the idea that what we call both sides of the slash, in our logo, we have a backslash. And we know that, you're not just your job title when you come to work. And we've made videos about it where we say when you walk through the door to our office, when you come to work, bring both sides of you, bring both sides of the slash, the job you have during the day, but the person you are all the time. Rhonda, who I mentioned earlier, is a very gifted artist. She has paintings in galleries all over, and at no point have any of us said, well, gosh, Rhonda, is this conflicting with your work? You're going to have to make a decision. That's just who she is. And we have a young lady, art director in our office in El Paso, who just last week launched a fashion retail brand. And it's a major thing. And I don't think, beyond calling her to congratulate her, I don't think anybody said, well, we're going to have to think about, the fork in the road for you because you can't do this. It's just part of who we are.
So this is not something that I personally feel like I've heard a lot of in my interactions with agencies, that when people come up with new ideas, you were working on, $100 million accounts, 3 of them. You had to give that up in order to go in this new direction, and somebody else had to take that on. So one of the things we talked about yesterday was we've got to invest more in people, we've got to train them up to do these jobs properly and prepare them for this new future and so on. it sounds like all of the agencies, both of the agencies that you work at, there's a real enlightened policy about that, and people were prepared to take you off of revenue-generating projects and put you into these new roles.
Yeah, I mean, I was a planner and strategist and had teams working for me, and then those individuals got opportunities to run those accounts. So it was a great opportunity for me to mentor people and sponsor their promotion as well, which I think is, you know, inherent to being an entrepreneur, wanting other people to rise to the occasion as well. I'm moving to Denver in 3 weeks, and the iCrossing executive team is like, great, we're gonna need someone in New York to do what you've been doing on the Collaboratory while you keep going on the West Coast, you know. So I think that maybe it's because you're digital, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I haven't worked at a traditional agency to see that kind of unfold, but I think there's an inherent ability for us in a digital agency to say, millennials' interests and their desire to change is gonna continue forever. That's a part of who they are, and it's a part of how they entered the world. And for strong leaders to cultivate that and to support that perpetual evolution is important going forward.
Yeah, so it might be a generational thing
Yeah.
for you guys. So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to take some questions, so think about that. But I'd like to just sort of formally ask you each to think about a piece of advice based on what we've talked about today. What would be your single piece of advice to take back to the agencies, assuming that there are people out there who would like to be intrapreneurs? If you could put it into a pithy headline, and I'll just keep talking for a bit while I can see you thinking about that out loud. So let's have some questions, or let's get people at the mics. I don't know if you made this point just now, or certainly in the phone call, about the benefit of retaining, of senior women in organizations to retention of young people. So make that point for us while you think about your
Absolutely.
closing.
I mean, and also because one of the things, I wasn't here yesterday, I apologize, I just had to fly in, but being maybe the self-nominated contrarian on the panel, I don't think we need to invest more in people, only because I've seen organizations that invest plenty, and they still have the precipitous, you know, cliff at the whatever that level is, right, where women don't stay.
Right.
And it isn't for lack of investment in the cases that I have seen. It is because women get to that point where they see that job that they've been working on their entire career, and now they're in the office next to it, and they're eating lunch next to it, and they're seeing the kind of hours that they work and how often they see their kids and how healthy their relationships are, and they're getting this close to that position that they've worked their entire life for, and they get close enough to realize, I don't want that. Thank you very much. So to me, that isn't about investing more in that woman. We invested in that woman when we got her all the way up that fast track, right? And then we got her close enough so that she could see what she was getting herself into, and she left. So to me, that means not investing more in them, but investing in changing the culture of what those senior leadership positions look like, especially for millennials, because they're going to be even more demanding. And saying what's broken with this. It might have worked before, it's not going to work anymore.
And that role of those women then becoming mentors for the younger generation coming through, is that something that you would advise becoming a formal aspect of the way that agencies and any organization work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought was great about your story about the founder having started at 50, we have a partner, much like John Gersma and other people that we bring to the table, who focuses on senior entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurs over the age of 50. And the actuarial data is really clear. And it's amazing because we live in such an ageist society that we don't hear this very often, but the data simply says that if you start a company over the age of 50, the chances of success is actually disproportionately higher than other segments of the population. So, thank you.
Yay, old people!
It's a fact. In fact, this woman that we're working with is actually working, she was testifying in front of the Senate Committee on Aging, specifically on petitioning policy change. So for example, making it so that people over the age of 50 can collect their entire unemployment benefit in one lump sum so that they can invest it in a business, for example, to encourage them to be more entrepreneurial. But I think that, you know, in the corporate world, that is a resource. The data shows that they're entrepreneurial. The data shows they're going to be disproportionately successful. The data shows that they're going to retain our younger talent because they'll be mentors. It's a no-brainer.
And it's kind of like a hidden, untapped asset that we just need to shine a spotlight on and say, there it is, everything you need right there. Okay, so let's get some questions. Who's got one? And keep thinking about your one piece of advice. We'll close with that exercise. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, how are you? My name is Maggie, and I work at Google. And my question is actually for Constance. I said that right. So you said that having a rigorous process was really important to your team, especially as you're introducing the concept. So I'm wondering how you avoid being too prescriptive or exclusive, and also sort of some tips for how to handle it when people might not necessarily agree with the guidelines that you're setting.
You hit them. That's a good question. So yes, iCrossing and most digital agencies are super entrepreneurial in their own right. And when you, as all of you know, when you work on a piece of business, you have your own kind of set of parameters and processes in place. So we have recommended ways of including the Collaboratory, and we have lots of very short sort of flow charts. And I think that the benefit of being a woman entrepreneur is that I have this sort of, I have a natural friendliness that comes with being a woman, which we often tout in settings like this as something you should shed. But it actually works really well to my advantage in a moment when you're introducing a new process. Like, I'll just come and sit in your meeting and we'll talk about how to make this work. But the one piece of advice I would give is scale. So think about how you're going to scale a process or a new discipline or invention or whatever it is. So I think the way you avoid being exclusionary and being too rigorous and letting people have freedom is giving people ownership over the thing that you've created. I consider myself a builder. I make something and then give it away. So I think that's the answer, is think about the scale and then give people ownership.
Yeah. Got anything to add to that, Scott? Your own process, or how did you get from there to there?
You know, we did very rigorous testing, and to make sure that, like I said earlier, that we weren't just kind of wishful thinking ourselves into it. But the most important thing for me has been to keep an open mind and to be positive.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many doors enthusiasm will open, which is great for me because that's about all I got. But you know, and you know, you can, once you say yes to something, you can always say no.
Yeah.
But once you say no to something, it's really hard to come back and say, oh, I really believe in it after all, let's do it. And it's amazing. And you know, growing up as a creative director, I woke up one day and I was 45 years old, and the creative teams in my office were 20 years younger than me with different sensibilities. And it forced me to really give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
You know, every instinct I had was kind of locked in, 1998 advertising, because that's where I kind of came of age. And so I would look at ideas and look at their approach, and my instincts would be, that doesn't feel right, but then I would have to say, okay, give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's when we did our best work. Mm. So I really became a big believer in yes, because saying no is easy.
So a lot of those Athena values that John talked about not being combative and confrontational perhaps in those situations, but being open, trying to find the way to yes as a way to keep the flow going in a conversation. It's good.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question.
I think that sometimes we also think about being an entrepreneur as being an inventor, and I think that those are two different things. I think if you're an inventor, then you're that sort of, in a room and inventing things, and not necessarily a collaborator. And I think that's the big distinction between an inventor and an entrepreneur. As an entrepreneur is by nature collaborative and knows that sort of, things don't happen and things don't scale unless you do have multiple players at the table.
I think that's absolutely true. And another thing about intrapreneurship, sometimes you've got huge organizations and people get frustrated because there's layers and policies, and they're like, if only I could kind of map out my own turf and kind of have this to myself and create my own thing. That's not what it's about. Collaboration is really critical. It's more about collaboration than anything. You may only do it with 2 or 3 people, and they have to find those right people.
Great. Another question.
Hi, my name's Lee Davidson. I'm from Chiat Day, Los Angeles. And my question is for Scott. Anyone can answer, but I think that you would have a good perspective. You say how you have employees that are entrepreneurs already, and they're starting fashion brands and doing all this great stuff. So do you stand behind them? Does the agency say you can take some of your time during the day to work on this, or we're going to get behind you? And is it appropriate as employees to say I want 15% of my time back to do projects on my own, or what's the appropriate balance?
Yeah.
Just don't bother working with us at all.
Yeah. We haven't asked for a percentage of anybody's time back so far. You know, Leslie Wingo and I were just talking about this yesterday because it is tough, and you know, I loved the idea yesterday. You know, fuck the policy, and that's harder sometimes, easier said than done. But we just try to have great people who are responsible and driven, and trust them to get the job done for our agency and do whatever it is they want to do as well. We don't you know, kind of look over people's shoulder, and if they're working on something of their own, you know, we're pretty busy. It's an agency, so there isn't a lot of downtime to do stuff. But we just trust people to use their own judgment. Now, if someone has an entire other business that they're operating, and we're seeing that their output and their work for our clients is really suffering, well, then we got to talk about that. But we really haven't seen that. I haven't had any conversation in 12 years at our agency where someone's work, someone's side hustle has, you know, hurt their work and had to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reality that everyone sits at their computer and thinks about their own things during the day. Like, we're creative people, and that's part of our DNA. So I just wonder, you know, if there's going to be a time where you can do both in a more open, supported kind of way. Like, obviously you have to take care of your responsibilities and be a good employee and, you know, help grow the business, but I just wonder if there's going to be more of a duality supporting that so you don't lose people to startups, because I would say the dream now is to do something of your own and get on board, which we see happening. So I was just curious if you guys were implementing a...
You know, it's never been like a policy, I think, but that's where things are going. You know, people are more and more embracing kind of three-dimensional lives, and I think companies are having to correspond with that. And like I said, it's always been part of our culture, and so it's not something we've had to, you know, address or deal with. You know, there's a school of thought that companies in the future will be a very small core team of leaders, and then the staff will be essentially freelancers or retained contract staff, especially businesses like ours, which is intellectual property. You know, where you'll have a small team, and then you will have you know, independent contractors forming these teams. And you know, when we get to that, we're definitely not going to be able to dictate, you know, what people do every minute of their day. You know, we're just going to have to judge their value by their results. And if you run a nonprofit on the side, yet you have great results for your work, that's going to have to speak for itself. It's going to be a bumpy process, but I think that's where it's going.
If I could tell a personal story on that, we're a small consultancy, marketing consultancy, that works with challenger brands, and we've lost 3 of our people to their own startup. Mm-hmm. And the only way to deal with it is to deftly weave that story into your own narrative about the positioning of your agency. So, you know, we pride ourselves on our ability to incubate new startups, and that's one of the things we do with clients.
And when we have had folks spin off and leave to do their own thing, we're very supportive. I mean, I can't see, you know, we're sad to lose people, and you know, it can be disruptive, but when you see people, we lost a creative director because she's a fabulous film director. And she wanted to put more time into that, and it was impossible to say no. You know, it was exciting. We were excited for her.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't say, oh, you know, can you just stay a little longer? We were like, you know, do it.
Okay, one more question.
Hi, my name is Bernadette Rivero, and I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a product of a school just like Barnard, and my company is called the Cortez Brothers. I'm a production company, so I work as a vendor to ad agencies, and I was so curious about the brief. Of all of the ad agencies I've worked with through the years, it sometimes feels like we're shooting in the dark, trying to guess what creative directors and producers want when we create a commercial or an internet video. And every once in a blue moon, an ad agency will share a brief with us, and it's like the lights have opened up, and we can illuminate and see what the thought process is from the beginning. But we also have ad agencies that say, no, we can't share that. That's intellectual property that we have to hold very tight. And I was curious, how do you use the data that you mine in these briefs? How often do you share them with your vendors, and why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, I'll send you 100 briefs. I mean, that's my output. You know, I'm like, God, clients pay so much for these keynote presentations. It's amazing. But I think there's probably two schools of thought on the brief. So the brief is designed to inspire the creative team internally at the agency. And then the idea gets presented to the client, and then the execution is done with, you know, folks like yourselves. And so you're so far from the briefing at that moment, unless you have an in-house studio, that that you think it's like it's over or something. And maybe we need to do a better job of sharing out and saying the brief, you know, gets attached to whatever we're sharing with everyone. And we probably, like, I would never think that a production house would need my brief. I don't know why anyone would be, like in my head I'm thinking like, why the hell do you need my brief? But if it would help you guys do your work, then the strategists and planners have to change. We have to change the way we think about it. And you know, we have an in-house production team. They sit on the briefing, so they hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So yeah, we could change that.
And we're the same way. We don't share our briefs with studios because they seldom ask for them, and it just would seem like more information that would, you know, create confusion. But if they wanted it, we'd certainly give it to them. And there have been a few cases where I have sent folks our brief just to give them a greater understanding. But, you know, we usually focus, if the brief results in a campaign idea, we focus on executing that idea with the studio. And like I said, if they really wanted it, we'd have no intellectual, you know, confidentiality or anything about that.
So let's bring this to a close with your 30 to 60 second soundbite, one piece of advice for all the budding entrepreneurs out there. Who wants to go first?
I already said mine. I think it's scale. Whatever you're doing, whatever you want to make sure you can scale it. Because if you just hold it, you know, to Scott's point about creating an island, or maybe Nathalie said, making this island, that does not work. If you want to see real change, you have to think about that long-term thing of what does it look like once you're gone? What does it look like once you move on? And start from there of like, what would it mean if your agency did everything differently based on your idea?
Great, thank you.
I would say that exercising the entrepreneurial muscles will never do you harm, whether you are within a large organization or not. It's just the kind of thing that will make you invaluable to anyone and will make you resilient for when, you know, the rug does get pulled out from under you. But I think that more importantly, it makes you an incredible asset and more of a valuable asset. The second piece, other than exercising the entrepreneurial muscles, however way you can. So I'm a huge advocate for moonlighting, just because it seems like training to me. But the other piece is also in terms of changing culture. I think that the older generations are not necessarily super well versed at sponsorship. And I think that if we are going to attract younger talent, if we're going to retain them, then those of us that have been there need to just exercise that muscle of doing more than just advocating and doing more than just providing great advice, but of actually taking ownership of people's ideas and sort of co-owning and co-sponsoring and making it, you know, putting skin in the game. Yeah. So I think that's huge, and I think that we need to do that. Women and men, but people who have, you know, a little more seniority, in order to bring that creative youth into the picture, and then more importantly, retaining them.
So Scott, hanging out with nerds?
Yeah. Well, for me, it gets back to that yes. I've never looked back and said, I wish I hadn't been so open-minded.
I think that's a great soundbite on which to end it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panel.
It's like I wish I didn't have